Welcome folks, Jason here for another video on Let's Make It Happen in Illustrator. And this video is going to be about patterns. How we can create patterns, how we can edit patterns, and apply patterns to any of our creations in Illustrator. The first thing we'll need is our Swatches panel. If you don't have that open, go into the Window menu, come down to Swatches. Our patterns live in the Swatches panel. So whenever you create a new Illustrator document, you may notice you'll have a list of colors, and then you'll have a couple gradients in here, as well as a couple pre-made patterns. And you apply a pattern just like you would a fill or a stroke to an object. So if I create a container, it fills with my pattern because I had that selected, but I can click on any other colors or gradients or anything else that's in my swatch panel, because that's where patterns actually live. And patterns are created just simply using vector artwork, and we're going to show you how to do that and how we can go and edit them. So let's start off with a basic square. I took a square, rotated it 45 degrees, put a fill and a stroke on it, and I would like to turn this into a pattern, which is quite simple to do. Under the Window menu, we're going to go to our Pattern Options, and it will call up the Pattern Options panel. It will be completely blank and looks like it's turned off. It's not, because once we have our object selected, we're going to click on the cheese grater, and we're going to choose the first option, which is Make Pattern. Once we make the pattern, it will tell us that this new pattern has been added to my swatch panel. Sure enough, there it is. There's my new pattern. And any changes, while made in pattern mode, will be applied to the swatch upon exit. Now this works a little bit differently than you would think, because you would think that after doing all your work, then it would show up in the swatches panel, but no, it pops up immediately. You can dismiss this if you don't want to be reminded of this, but I'm leaving it on so that you can see. In the pattern options, I'm going to name my pattern so that I can have that show up here in my swatches panel. And I can choose the tile type. Right now we have a grid. We can do a brick by row, which is going to be, in this case, a half offset, or you can do a 1/3 offset, and all these different methods of both horizontal and vertical offsets. You can also do a brick by column, and then of course do your different offsets, as well as going in and choosing your hex by column or your hex by row. So a lot of different options that you can start with. I'm just going to start off with a brick by row for now and show you what we can do with this. So I've got my border around my artwork, and this is called the tile, and this is where the artwork is going to happen. You can select the shape inside and do anything that you want to manipulate this shape, and you can see how this pattern is now going to be created. Down here at the bottom of the panel, we have the number of copies. And this just gives you a larger or smaller view of how your pattern is going to be created. You can also dim the repeating pattern so that you can have it more intense or less intense. I like to keep it screen back so I can focus on how this works. But if you're dealing with fine detail, you may want to bump up the opacity here so you can really see how those things are coming together. So if I change any of this, you can see that it will change my entire pattern. We can also go outside the tile. If I hold down my Shift key and I make this bigger, you can see that it will go outside the tile, and that will allow us to then overlap our shapes. Anything that stays inside the tile will then simply touch right to the very edge. If you want it to touch, and so like having these points touch perfectly here, it's a little tricky to get your object right to the edge of the tile. So what we can click on is Size Tile to Art, so that it snaps right to it. So you can be guaranteed that the edges of your object will then be touching the edge of your tile, and therefore the repeating patterns will touch those edges. Once you click the Size Tile to Art button, you can now go in and you can now adjust the spacing. If you would like more or less space between the horizontal or the vertical overlap, you can do this. So if I put my cursor in the horizontal spacing field and I use my up arrow, I can very easily control the spacing horizontally. but I can also use my down arrow if I would now like to overlap those, like I've done here. With a vertical spacing, I can also use my down arrow to bring them closer together, or my up arrow to put them further apart. So here, I think this is looking kind of like I want, kind of this scalloped look, and I think this can work just fine. Now, in order to save this, which interestingly enough, it has already saved the initial pattern in the Swatches panel, we go up to the gray bar that's here at the top, and I don't want to save a copy because this is just going to give me a duplicate of this pattern that I've created, and I don't want that. I just want this pattern. So I'm just simply going to click Done. And Done is going to save the changes that we've made. When we see Save a Copy, we think, oh, I need to press Save here, but then you end up with two. One that's just the basic square, and then one is the pattern that we have just created. So I'm going to click the Done button, and there is my set of squares as a pattern. So let's see how this works. So I'm going to draw a shape, and then I'm going to apply my squares to it right there. There we have it. Now you'll notice I also have a border. Well, interesting. Patterns can be applied to a border as well. So in my control bar, I can go up and I can apply the same pattern to the border, or I can say no border. And patterns are not just for fills. You can do them on strokes as well. So there's my pattern, and looks great. But here's the tricky part. If I wanted to move this container, I can move everything with this pattern, but that's not necessarily how it happens. So I'm going to call up my Transform panel here, and you can do that under the Window menu, call up Transform. And under the Transform cheese grater here, we have three different ways we can go in and work with patterns and our objects. Many times, people will have this Transform Object Only button selected, which allows you to move the object, but the pattern stays in the same place, which is completely baffling. So it's almost like I'm moving my window around and the pattern is not moving. That's because of our choice here in the Transform panel. Then we have Transform Pattern Only, which you would think, oh, I can just click and move the pattern. Well, that's not really what it means. What it means is I can now go in and I can rotate or skew or change the size of my pattern without changing any of those attributes on my container. So in my Transform panel, if I rotate my pattern 45 degrees, you'll notice that the container didn't rotate 45 degrees, but my pattern did. I'm going to undo that. And the third option, which is probably the way that most people would think this works, is transforming both the image, or transforming both the pattern and the container at once. So if I were to go in and I were to hold down my Shift key and I were to scale this, you notice that my pattern and my container size the same. So those are three very important aspects of using the Transform, Object Only, Pattern Only, or both when you're working with a pattern, because it can be very confusing and in some cases very annoying. So this was a very simple construction with a pattern. I'm going to show you a couple other ones that will lead us to a couple other interesting solutions. Here I've got some ovals that I created, just kind of a random set, and I'm going to turn this into a pattern as well. So under the Window menu, Pattern Options, and again it's blank because I have to click on the cheese grater. I have to choose Make Pattern, and it reminds me, yes, thank you. So here's what my pattern looks like. I'm going to increase the opacity a little bit more so I see how this looks. Now my artwork is snapped to the tile, and I'm getting a pretty good overlap here, or a pretty good pattern, but I can also come in here and click on any one of these shapes and edit these shapes. Now I just use my up, down, left, right arrows on my keyboard to move these shapes, so I don't move them too far with my cursor. You can move them however you want. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to start having these come outside of my defined tile. So now I can work on how these actually nest together in my final pattern. Because, we don't actually build this with this kind of overlap because the tile will snap right to the edges of everything. So once we violate the edges of the tile, then we start getting that mixing and intermingling of these shapes with each other in the pattern repeat, so that it doesn't look like these are just kind of sections put together that aren't really meshing together like we should. And so when you get the pattern and looking the way you want it to look, we can say this is great. Now, I don't want to size the tile to the art in this case because I want this to go outside the tile so that it then creates kind of more interlocking sections. So this can work good. Now, I'm still using the grid here, but I still can do different ways that I can come in here and display that. But I can use just the standard grid, which is I'm using here. I'm not going to use any offset because I want these to kind of like interlock like a puzzle. So right now, I think this is fine. I think it's looking good. So I'm going to name this in the name section, and I'm going to click Done, and there are my ovals. So of course, I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to draw a container. Of course, it still has my pattern on the outside edge. I'm going to turn that off. But now if I click on my ovals, it's going to fill that, and I get just what I want. Works great. Now there's a trickier one. And here I've created some lines, and with these lines, I would like to put them together so that the strings actually touch the ends. And this is where things can get really tricky when you're trying to go in and make a pattern work. I'm going to show you what I mean by this. With the pattern options, I'm going to click on the cheese grater, make it a pattern, and click OK. Let's zoom in here and let's see exactly how these ends come together. Well, I see where these ends come together, I get this kind of disjointed effect because they're not connecting perfectly. Well, with this pattern preview here and my ability to dim back these other repeated sections here, I can go in and I'm going to use my direct selection tool so I can directly select the end point here, and I'm going to zoom in quite large so we can see. And I'm going to come in here and I'm going to move this to get these lines to line up. So when I do this, I will no longer have that disconnect between the connections of the lines. I'm going to do this one by one as I go through, and this is working pretty cool because now I can get this so it looks good. One thing you may notice is Illustrator has this kind of snap feature that likes to remember where these points are. There's a setting in your preferences that says if it gets within, say, 3 points of your initial point, it wants to snap to it. So sometimes you have to move that point out of the way completely, let go of your cursor, and then come back here so that you can get it to snap back in correctly. Okay? And that happens when your point is very, very, very close, and you try to move it just a little bit, and it likes to snap back to its original location. Now I'm going to zoom back out, and I think I've got a really good repeating pattern where the ends, now you can't tell where the seam is. So I'm liking this. Now, while you're in the middle of this too, you can come in here and you can change any of the attributes on any piece of your artwork here. So if I were to come in and select one particular line here, where I could go in and select one line, and I could change the attributes of one. Maybe I'd like to go in and change the color of this. I can do that too. Just click on that, and it changes the color. I'll click on this one, and I'm going to change this color as well. Kind of mix it up a little bit. Now I'm going to name this. So I'm going to call this my wavy gravy. And I'm going to click the Done checkbox up at the top. Let's zoom back out, and let's see how successful we were with going in and making sure this works. So I'm going to draw my container. Of course, I still have my stroke on from my initial one that I had created. Now I've got my container. Now I'm going to put in my wavy gravy. Looks great. I love it. Now it doesn't give me that disconnect in between those ends. And so I've just created 3 different types of patterns quite quickly. And if I ever want to edit these patterns, this is really cool. So if I find out that there's something that needs to be changed in one of these patterns, all I have to do is go back into my Swatches panel and double-click on the icon next to the name of the swatch. It will call up your original artwork, it'll call up your pattern options, and you can make the edits here directly on your artwork. Now, if you do this, but you want to keep your original one here, this is where you go in and you save a copy. So if I decide that I'm going to make this line a different color here and decide that I'm going to add some orange in here, now if I choose Save a Copy, it's going to keep my original and it's going to give me this new updated one as a second pattern. So if I click Save a Copy, I'm going to name it. So of course this is going to be Wavy Gravy 2. And I click OK. Now I have those two in there. I didn't save over my previous one. So it's really quite simple to do this. And now I'm done. I'll click the Done button. Everything works great. So you can create just about anything you could possibly imagine in here with a pattern, with anything. I want to show you the Pompadour. I'm going to select my shape, and I'm going to put the Pompadour in here. Make sure I put it in my fill, not my stroke. And this looks a little bit more complex. Well, let's find out how they actually did this. I'm going to double-click on the thumbnail, and I'm going to screen all of the copies back here. Now what they've done here is they've actually used opacity, and they've got 3 sets of things going on in here that are overlapping. Sure, you can do that. So if I select the first set here, I'm going to delete that, okay? And you can see that we now have this lighter set in back, and I can delete that, and then we have the darker set here. So they just use this overlay feature on top in order to create this cool effect, and then just used opacity, and you can use blending modes, and put this all together. So that's pretty cool the way they do that. Now, if you need inspiration, not a problem. Go to your Swatches cheese grater, go to the drop-down menu, and go to your Swatch library. They have patterns built into the standard default in Illustrator. So if you're looking for just some graphics, dots, lines, textures, okay, let's call up textures. It calls up its own floating panel. And if I create a shape here, I'm going to go in and grab a shape, and I can simply click on any one of my textures here, and I can add these and see how this works, see how these have been created like that. Yeah, a lot of fun stuff. And there's some really good ones in here. Well, I like this one. It's like, oh my gosh, how did they create that? Well, anytime that you apply a pattern to a shape, it automatically puts it into your Swatches panel as being a used texture or a pattern. If you want to see how this is done, double-click on the thumbnail next to the name of the pattern in the Swatches, and you can come in here and you can zoom in and you can dissect exactly how they did this. All it is a rectangle with a circle in the middle to kind of give this brick. And they built it with the offset here, but you can go in and you can do brick by row, you can do brick by column, and you can see how that changes. You can do the offset too, and play with everything just like that. I'm going to click cancel so I don't save over that. Now, not only do they have basic patterns and textures here, but you can also go in and do decorative. So decorative, monster patterns, nature, so animal skins, foliage, that kind of stuff. So have fun, explore, and look at this. Oh my gosh, look at all these animal skins. Okay? Yeah. Well, that's pretty awesome. It is. And remember, if you want to scale a pattern but not scale your container, this is where you're going to go under your Transform cheese grater, and you're going to choose Transform Pattern Only. And then in your Transform panel, what you can do in the width and the height here is you can increase the width or the height, and I'm just using my up arrow and down arrow, keeping my container the same, but allowing me to scale the pattern larger or smaller without scaling the container itself. Of course, you can then rotate this, so if you'd like that to go 90 degrees, you can rotate this without rotating the actual shape itself. You can still manipulate the shape if you'd like, but you have that option to do just the shape or your object, just your pattern, or adjust them both. Because you never know what size you really need to have this pattern created at, so this gives you the ability of going in and allowing you to scale or transform just the pattern or just the object, or in this case now, if I've got this right here, I can transform both so that if I want to make it larger or smaller and kind of crunch it, now both my container and my patterns are going to scale. But if I didn't want the pattern to scale, then I just simply say transform the object, keep the pattern at the same size, and when I do that, the pattern stays the same size, and then when I move this around, the pattern stays fixed, in there, and this kind of creates a window. And that works with any of these. Pretty cool. And you'll notice that once you size the pattern down inside your object, when you apply other patterns, that same size will take hold with it. So it remembers the size of the pattern. It doesn't just go in and give you the full size pattern here. It remembers the size. So if you do apply a pattern to a shape and you notice that this pattern is much smaller than normal, it's because you've previously sized down the pattern here and it remembers that. So go try it, folks. See what it does. Patterns are a lot of fun.